anecdotally, as an individual, I can't see what the driver is for me to dramatically increase my mobile data consumption.
Yeah, so they're not going into if they're in their Dragon's Den meeting like Ericsson with all those weirdos. You don't really have a clue anyway. Half of them.
I fucking hate that. I've never watched it because.
But if they were in their Dragon's Den meeting and they were going, well, we need to spend all this money on these really expensive radios, and they were going, well, what's that all going to be for? Then they'd have a really hard time, I think, trying to sort of they'd probably start bringing up things like Vonage and APIs and completely lose them.
Yeah, or start talking about VR or robotic surgery or whatever these other silly utopian things that we've taken a piss out.
Yeah, and then the thing is, it's not even that those things won't happen actually. Because they might. It's, well, how do the operators make money out of that then? Because it's just more connectivity revenues, isn't it? It just replaces what people are spending on connectivity. It's like when data came along with 4G and everybody went, oh, they're making loads of money from 4G data now, and it's like a great growth. It wasn't a growth opportunity at all because people had spent more on voice services in the past, and all it did was replace that.
Hello and welcome to your second Telecoms.com podcast of the week. We committed to 2 this week because we thought we were going to have a guest today, but they had to pull out at the last minute for personal reasons. But because I perhaps rather rashly on the one that we recorded 2 days ago said that we were coming in today, I felt we couldn't bail on you, our devoted audience. So it's just the 2 of us, and we haven't got much news to play with. So this might be even more unstructured and just us.
Imagine I think we're going to every day.
Yeah, well, a lot of people do.
God,
I mean, I reckon we could.
That's going to be really
I think
tough.
We'd struggle to do a 2-hour one every day. Unless we had a guest. 2-hour ones with a guest are always easy because you got at least an hour of it.
We're not doing one next
shit.
week, right? So
you what?
We're not doing one next week. So
no, week after. You remember you fucked that one up.
Oh, sorry, week after.
You had me worried because we got a guest booked in next week and we were chatting on our little Teams group and Pierre was
it took a long time to get to the point that I just wanted a mate to come out afterwards.
Yeah.
Well,
because Pierre got his dates as he just did again. I'm starting to wonder if he's going to turn up next week. He's got it in his head that we're not doing one. He's got his dates mixed up with half term, which is a week after.
Yeah, you're right.
But anyway.
The thing is, he confuses everybody about when bank holidays are then. You're looking at your diary like, isn't it the Monday? And
yeah.
Well, so people listening, I'm the one who organised it. I'm the one who I sort of vet incoming pitches. Chat to people and all that sort of thing. We get a few. We've had a few actually. That's not true. We've had a few that have been pitched by you, Ian. But I suppose I deal with like 90% of them.
Yeah.
And I've just got a little spreadsheet, and every now and then I share the spreadsheet with Ian and Pierre to make sure that we haven't got any cross wires. And they never fucking look at it because with a week later they're like, "Who we got next week?" And I sarkily reshare the spreadsheet again.
Yeah.
Anyway, we somehow get there. I don't think we've ever had a major screw up where we didn't turn up when there was a guest or something like that. I just thought I'd bitch about how shit and inefficient you two are before we get going. Right, what was I going to say? Obviously not much opening bollocks to talk about, but we did go out with Dave after the pod, and we went to the Rose and Crown, and a couple of his mates and colleagues came along, Pasquale and Detlef. So shout out to you three. That was all good fun, and Dave's been very kind, sort of talking about it on LinkedIn and sending us emails and all that sort of thing. So thanks a lot for that, Dave. That was really interesting.
An actual Dave, not
just a bloke whose name I forgot and I called Dave by default. I do think it should be law that everyone's called Dave to save me fucking names up.
Yeah. Did you just say hello, Dave, to people when you run into them at a press conference and you can't remember who it is?
Yeah, if I really want to freak them out, I'll say it in the League of Gentlemen way. Because did you watch the League of Gentlemen?
Yeah.
And so in the second series, they had this incredibly unsettling circus master. No, the circus master called Papa Lazarou.
Yeah.
And he just used to go up to people and go, "Hello, Dave." And he just called everyone Dave, even women. "Hello, Dave." You should watch it. It's so brilliantly done. Anyway, so we went out with them. That's the only shout out I want to do, and we're going to get to the point because we've all got places to be in less than 2 hours. So what we're going to do for this one, given that we haven't got that much news to draw upon, and it's just 2 of us, we might just revisit a few more things and just do it more just Scott and Ian style, where we can just argue the toss a little bit and we don't have to pretend to be polite to our guests and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that
saying Dave was talking rubbish.
No, I'm saying that when we haven't got a guest, that's when we can, where we don't have to make any allowances for any third party. Not that the conversation with him wasn't brilliant, and all our other guests for that matter. But it's just a slightly different social dynamic when it's just two of us, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's all I'm saying. And LinkedIn, I think, is providing some of the inspiration, and we alluded to it on the one with Dave, where there've been a couple of Ian stories that have been put up, and they've elicited a few reactions. In fact, before I go any further, I want to say to our audience, I'm going to try and muck around with AI a little bit, and I want to try and, when I publish the podcasts, maybe have a written summary of them as well. And my ultimate objective is, because we don't have comments on our... why are you looking worried? No, I said this to you a minute ago. I don't know why you're freaking out.
AI.
Is because we don't have comments on our stories on either site, because we use the same platform. I just think it'd be really cool if we got a bit more engagement on LinkedIn with our podcast. So I'm going to try and promote it by perhaps offering a bit more of a summary of what's going on, see if people want to bite.
I could do that for you, actually.
Okay. Yeah, well, then let's chat about it. If you can easily transcribe the whole thing, then we can get AI to just summarise it.
A few clicks. Yeah, actually, I'm going to try right now with the last one and tell you.
Okay. All right. So anyway, but the reason I'm saying this to our audience now is I'm asking you on LinkedIn. I suppose you could do it on Twitter as well, but Twitter's a bit more chaotic. I quite like LinkedIn because you don't get much trolling. You might get a few people like that geezer we mentioned the other day, not being particularly civil in their response, but that's fine. Bring it on. Tell me I'm full of shit. I'm cool with that. The only thing I will say is, if you can lead with your chin, you might get slapped. So I mean that metaphorically. So by all means lead with your chin, but don't expect me and Ian to just take it.
As it's
a Ray Winston impression when you said that.
Yeah.
As it's a public forum, obviously, I don't have any hesitation to call people out if they.
No, totally. They've willingly put their opinions in the public domain.
Someone emailing you confidentially.
100%. No, and we'd always respect that. But yes, anyway, I encourage it. Let's see if anyone bites. But I know quite. I'm always bumping into people who listen to it, so there is a decent audience out there. And just engage on LinkedIn, and we might have some fun chat in between pods. And so, on that note, William Webb, who's a very regular guest on this pod and a wireless expert, has reposted a couple of your articles recently, and we have touched on this already. So just to warn people in advance, we are going to cover quite a lot of ground that we've already covered, just from maybe a slightly different perspective. Mm-hmm. But we only had 2 days of news, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we're gonna get into some of the feedback there's been on those. There was another one where it wasn't directly calling you out, but it's definitely directly related to one of your stories from another regular guest, Dean Bubley. Where he had that meme about the upper 6 gigahertz band.
I was glad to see. I think Dean said something like "shout out to Ian Morrison."
Yeah, he did.
But he made
comments.
My controversial headline implying there's a contradiction there with this sort of asking for this upper 6 gigahertz band that would be very expensive to deploy. Not long after saying we just want something that doesn't involve a big hardware refresh was a contradiction.
Yeah. Well,
that was the same point Dean made. I was glad
exactly
because I hadn't actually read that before.
Yeah, and we'll dig back into that, and maybe we'll revisit a little bit of that anonymous email that you got.
But I think it's interesting that obviously some people do. I mean, there's been a bit of pushback from people like Gabe on that, our colleague Gabriel Brown.
Yeah, and Gabe, if he was in the office and was available, I would have happily grabbed him to have him deliver that pushback in person.
For sure.
I mean, he's a great guy. We got well with him,
and he's got good.
And I respect the fact that he's not afraid to disagree. I mean, that's what it should all be about.
Yeah,
we're pretty far from omniscient.
Yeah, but it's nice to see there's a sort of division of opinions there, isn't there? But
exactly. Well, that's the fun bit, and that's why I want people to engage on LinkedIn. I think it could be a good sort of little community for people to argue the toss about this stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll cover one or two of those things, and there have been some newsy things that are a little bit more in the sort of geopolitical side. Mm-hmm. But I think they're relevant. I mean, obviously, we can be a bit more self-indulgent. You know me, we always have this tension of I'm inclined to go off on all sorts of random non-telecoms tangents.
Yeah.
But I think each of these we can justify at least partially in a telecoms way. And I would always assert that anything that affects trade and business affects all industries, of which telecoms is one. So I think the more big picture stuff is valid every now and then. So, yeah, I'll just get straight into it then. Why don't we go back to the older one, which William Webb put up a week ago. It's an excellent article, as always, from Ian Morris, where he's kindly included some quotes from me. It's a slightly bit of self-interest there, William, but we'll let you off. I hope it nudges the mobile industry towards some clear thinking. And this is one, and I'll say it again, we have mentioned this before on the pod, but we'll cover it again, where you wrote, this is dated May the 7th, the 6G, quote, golden band, close quote, is probably worthless in mobile. And so why don't you, before I get into comments on LinkedIn, why don't you, for our audience, just quickly recap what the core theme of that piece was?
So there's a lot of debate at the moment about what spectrum is going to be used for 6G. Where that could be deployed. If you remember a little while ago, there was all sorts of fuss made about terahertz spectrum, which is right up there in the gods. And you always joke that you have to be sitting on a base station to use millimetre wave. And by the way, I talked to somebody who's a bit of an expert on all this sort of stuff earlier in the week, and he sort of very much went along with your sitting on he was drawing me little diagrams of like concentric circles and what you get in terms of propagation, and it really is you
don't need to be a telecoms expert or a physicist to know that diminishing propagation means it's harder to get a signal.
So I think that the focus has now shifted. I think people have sort of kind of given up on terahertz. In fact, there's a guy called Kevin Holly who works for BT. He's on the standard side at BT. And he was posting some messages after this big get-together in South Korea saying that terahertz seems to have been sort of put back into the box, at least until 7G, So, and meanwhile, the focus has shifted to lower spectrum bands, but still not low. So they're partly looking at this upper 6 gigahertz band, which we talked about quite a lot on Wednesday, and that was one of the pieces that I wrote. And then this other one that you're referring to there is going up a bit above that to, it's not even one band really, it's a broad range starting at 7 gigahertz and going up to about 15 gigahertz. And I think the bits that the mobile industry...
Calling it golden band seems very disingenuous.
Yeah, the bits that they always do this though, don't they? To try and sort of emphasise how important it is to them, I think. But the bits that they're really interested in are getting, or the bits that would be perhaps more readily available whenever I've talked to anybody about this, are the bottom bit of it, so sort of 7 to 8.
Right.
And then the top bit, kind of 13 to 15. I don't know why that bit in between those isn't sort of it might not be available. It might just be an issue of
military or satellite.
Well,
or broadcast
7 to 8 is an issue for military, apparently.
Right. Okay.
We can come on to that later because there's some interesting things to say about that. But this is this very broad range of spectrum. The kind of bottom part of it and the upper end of it is this part of this kind of golden band that basically 6G is looking at. And that was the basis of that piece, which was to say, how much use are you really going to get out of these bands, considering that, you're at the top end of that, you're only just below the millimetre wave range, this 13 to... So people are pretty sceptical as it is about the upper part of that. So let's say the value then really is in the 7 to 8 gigahertz. That's still very, very high. There's been a lot of complaints about going up to 3.5 and all the problems we've had with that in terms of getting good indoor penetration and, cell edge problems and this sort of thing without any densification. And the basic thesis of the piece is that if you're going to deploy that and try and make use of it for kind of mass market mobile deployment, you'd have to be building out a lot of very, very advanced radio unit equipment. This massive MIMO technology that sort of came along with 5G, where people basically cram more antennas into the radio units, more transmitters and receivers to improve capacity and coverage. And it's gone up to sort of 64 transmitters, 64 receivers with 5G. You're going up to kind of twice that number, I think, in the 7 to 8 gigahertz range, really, and maybe 256 when you get up to 13 to 15, which is it's really expensive stuff. It's big and heavy. Earl Lum, who I spoke to on the record about it, was... he was saying that some of the stuff that I can't say whose equipment he saw, but some of the stuff that he'd seen at MWC was like sort of 4 feet.
Is this the right juncture to address that anonymous email you got from an industry expert? Was that about that story and about that the general assertion that which is the broader theme, if I understand it correctly, is like it's all very well going on about new spectrum, but there's the contradiction between going on about new spectrum and saying that we shouldn't need loads more kit.
That email that we were talking about, I think just before we came on, was more about the upper 6 gigahertz band.
Okay.
I mean, they are very related, obviously. The upper 6 gigahertz band is right next to the 728.
6, 7, 8.
I mean,
What's that between friends?
Yeah, it's not radically different. So, but I think the contradiction point for me was this letter that the GSMA came out with that we talked about quite a bit on the last one of these, where they're kind of pleading for.
Is that the one that you just wrote up?
That's not the one I wrote today. That's the one I wrote. That's that's the mixed messages and first one.
Oh, right.
That's the one that I thought there was a contradiction. Mixed messages, yeah. I mean, saying a few months ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, but certainly the message from the NGMN and people like that, which is a very significant body of big telcos, saying we want software upgradable 6G, we don't want a big hardware refresh, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And then coming out with a letter saying it's absolutely imperative that we get the whole of the upper 6 gigahertz band is, to me, a contradiction, because if you get that upper 6 gigahertz band, and they're obviously not going to be allowed to sort of have it and just sit on it and not do anything with it, if they're kind of being given the whole thing, they're going to be held to these sorts of coverage obligations and whatnot. Just seems like a contradiction, because to deploy it, you'd have to spend so much money to deploy it for mobile.
And to my superficial understanding of the matter, it all makes sense. There's so many reasons why higher frequency spectrum is not a panacea. It's delivered as a panacea because, as we spoke about on the pod a couple of days ago, there's lots of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that famous joke, where someone goes into a restaurant and says to the person they're with, they go, "There's good news and bad news." The bad news is the food's shit. The good news is there's lots of it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what applies. We know that spectrum. I know I'm using my sort of crude language, but we know that spectrum's relatively shit compared to something that's like sub 1 gigahertz, or even compared to something that's sub 3 gigahertz. I mean, it's just a directly proportional or inversely proportional relationship in terms of quality. Let me quick finish. And so I get that. So I get that's why it's not a panacea, but I get that what you can do to compensate for that is obviously have new kit and use clever technologies like beamforming to optimize the quality of that. But I can't see any fault in your repeated assertion that there's a contradiction between saying 6G is not going to require a new upgrade cycle and 6G is going to have a bunch more new spectrum.
Yeah. I think it's a bit more nuanced. So if we're talking about the guy who I got pushback from in the email, and I think that I read that out on Wednesday, but he was essentially saying that the point you just made, you could use the upper 6 gigahertz band to provide sort of hotspot coverage in really congested areas. And then in the areas where you've got now, a guy I spoke to this week, who I just mentioned, he's a sort of spectrum expert and a radio engineer as well, has some kind of sympathy for that view that you'd
densification thing.
You wouldn't necessarily densify, but you could put, what he was saying is you could put these upper 6 gigahertz radios, these very advanced ones, into areas like a city centre, for instance, where you've really got a lot of traffic. Now, we don't really know what's going to happen with traffic growth. Is this one of the concerns here? Obviously, is traffic actually going to grow, or is it going to flatten, like William Webb says?
Indeed.
And the guy I was chatting to was very sort of sympathetic to William's arguments on that. But he also said, we just don't know. Yeah, regulators can't approach this with the sort of certainty that William's come into it with. He's kind of stuck his neck out quite a bit with this, and you can always be wrong. I mean, people back in the days of 3G, I remember people saying, "Oh, it's never going to be needed for doing." No one envisaged Uber or video streaming or that sort of stuff. So we don't really know for sure.
Yeah.
We can see what's going on, and I'm sympathetic to William's point of view, but we don't know for sure.
Well, the other thing we don't know for sure, compared to some people who are working on the inside, such as we suspect your anonymous emailer and some of the people in LinkedIn comments that I'm going to mention. I mean, we could do a whole bit just on your mate Kumar Balachandran.
Yeah.
Fair play to him. While we quite rightly called him out for a sort of below the belt ad hominem attack, there's tons of other stuff he's written that isn't an ad hominem attack, some of which we'll get into. And these people have a certain insight into, let's take, for example, why. Because, the opening question I asked Dave on Wednesday, which is like, why are they always clamouring for more spectrum? Now, it could be they know stuff that we don't. about traffic demand specifically in city centres and shit like that, and then we've got like airports, shopping malls, stadiums, all that sort of thing.
On that point, I know more than I did even a few days ago.
Okay, go on then.
So if you were to take like a cell that's sort of this big in a city centre.
He's showing something that's about a foot across.
Yeah, and then so a big circle that's covered by. I mean, it wouldn't be that big. Let's say you're using 3.5 gigahertz or something, and you roll out like an upper 6 gigahertz band radio in the middle of that, where that's the very busiest point. What it does is it relieves. One of the points of doing this is it relieves a lot of the pressure. So you know, one of the things
dynamically move.
You know, one of the this is where I got some pushback in this conversation I had this week on the point about 5G being a complete waste of time and it's never really been monetized. So bearing in mind this guy who I'd like to name him because a lot of the stuff he actually said was on record, but there's a few things that he didn't. So I'm just going to be safe and not name him.
Yeah.
But he said, and he, by the way, these are people who the company that he works for. These are people that are kind of closely linked with operators, and they're deep in the weeds of all this, and they see all the traffic patterns, they see all the data, they know what's going on. If we'd not had those 3.5 gigahertz bands coming into use, we'd all have a massive problem with 4G services now.
Okay, well that's good.
We'd have
that's
because
good to know.
Traffic growth might be slowing now for sure, but what's happened since in the last 5-6 years, you go back over that period since this technology was rolled out, there was already in those bands that were being used for 4G, there was already this is the real reason I think they needed the 5G spectrum, is because those were just becoming congested.
Right.
And if we'd not had this technology come along, then you'd have ended up with quality problems. You'd have ended up with service problems. Everybody now the way he put it is that, when 3G was being used and it was really quite crap, your experience of 4G today, if there hadn't been 5G rolled out, would be like that.
Cool. No, I think that's really good. That's really good insight. And what it does is it sort of corrects the record when it comes to I'll speak only for myself. My sort of push back on 5G, which is that it's been kind of meh when it comes to new revenue streams, when it's come to consumer, like overt consumer experience. But what your the person you're speaking to seems to be saying is, but actually it has helped consumer experience in part by providing a crutch for 4G.
Yeah,
especially in high congestion.
Yeah, and then the other point I got from that I thought was interesting, and you probably quite like to talk to him about this at some point, was this idea that 5G itself fundamentally isn't any different from 4G. Yeah. Yeah. So if you roll it out in the same spectrum bands you were using for 4G, it's pretty much the same thing. So he went along with that to a big extent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same air interface. Yes. Yeah. You're right to some extent. However, there's two caveats with that. One is that massive MIMO, which kind of gets regarded as a 5G technology. I mean, he did make the point that actually people were doing a bit of it with 4G, and it's not actually it's not really a 4G thing, massive MIMO. It's almost like a separate thing. But it did kind of come along as 5G was being introduced, and it had value in these spectrum bands that you were putting 5G in, and that does make a big difference. Massive MIMO. I mean, the word you just mentioned, beamforming, and this sort of stuff. That's something that wasn't there before. And then the other,
but I still quickly butt in, and maybe this is part of the answer. It's still not obvious to me when it comes to the holy triangle of 5G, which is mobile broadband, low latency, and the machine, the IoT stuff. Forget about the IoT stuff. I always thought that's bollocks. That's just a gradual improvement. Yeah. But on the broadband side, it's still not obvious to me what is unique to 5G as opposed to just continuing the rate of progress that was happening with 4G.
But that's what I'm talking about, continuing the rate of progress.
Yeah.
Because you can make the point that you're not even continuing the rate of progress. That's what we've said.
Right.
If you take the technology and it's OFDM based and you put it in the same spectrum band that you're using for 4G, do you really get any improvement?
And then all you're doing is putting massive MIMO and just having radios that can just have a fatter pipe.
Yeah, but that's the point. That's the thing he was saying. That's the real innovation that's come along. Is those
an innovation? It feels like
massive
just
MIMO,
more of the same.
A massive big boost into that. Wasn't around years ago. Massive MIMO.
When did we first start talking about it?
I mean, it's not a thing that we ever had with 3G, massive MIMO, and it's not a thing that was associated with 4G.
Okay,
although as I say, he made the point that there was a bit of it going on, and you could do it with 4G, but it was still something that was very much associated with the 5G era, and it was being done as 5G was being standardized. And that was his pushback. He's like, yeah, the air interface is the same for sure, but massive MIMO is a kind of innovation. Right. The other one is the channels. So being able to do like 100 megahertz carrier rather than 20 megahertz.
Yeah.
That's something that came with, and that's not massive MIMO linked. That's something that 5G brought that you couldn't do.
Oh, so that's a different concept. That's
a different concept. Massive MIMO is putting lots of transmitters and receivers into antenna units, as far as I'm aware. That's what massive.
Yeah,
MIMO is.
and I'd assumed, and you're just correcting me now. I'd assumed that's how you get a 100 megahertz channel rather than 20 megahertz channel, is just by doing the same thing times 5.
Well, but I think you need. I think there's more to it than that.
Right, obviously.
And the improvements that you had on these fatter channels, you could do. In 5G, I think without massive MIMO, you can get these fatter channels compared with 4G, and you need less equipment to do it. Basically, you needed more stuff to do it with in 4G essentially. So those were his two kind of pushbacks on the kind of point
Fair
that
enough.
5G hasn't really brought. He's not talking about it from the perspective of 5G should be helping us to smell over the, I mean,
smell-o-vision.
At the end of the day, we're talking about a connectivity technology.
Yeah.
So it's only ever going to, this is a problem I think sometimes that people have when they look at the Gs and go, oh, well, what's it doing differently than its predecessor didn't do? You're talking about a connectivity tech. There's only so far it can go. It's not going to serve you beer.
Yeah.
It's like saying...
But the difference in mobile broadband between 3G and 4G was like a step change.
Yeah, well, I mean, the difference then was...
So that set the expectation for a step change with each G.
That's a different service entirely. That's why I think it was generationally a thing for people, because they weren't used to getting the internet on their phone. After that, it's always going to be about getting faster or getting low signal delays.
And we've mentioned him already, but our colleague Gabe has been on the pod and in private pushing back on some of our more scathing critiques of 5G, and that's fair enough. It's good to hear. But I don't want to believe that our big bright idea is bollocks for our whole industry, that's for sure. But
I think the problem for this is the problem with things like network exposure and the programmable network and all this sort of trying to label connectivity, trying to make a connectivity technology sound more exciting than it really is. I'm not saying it isn't exciting, by the way. It's pretty amazing you can do this stuff.
I find it riveting.
Yeah, but you think back to 30 years ago when you'd have to get an A to Z to go out around London, and you'd have to arrange to meet somebody before.
I mean, it might have been the magic of the mobile internet is something. Well, that's what I mean. I've been marvelling at since before I started this job when I was a smartphone analyst. I used to call it a digital Swiss Army knife. Yeah, which is incredible, the power that you've now just got in the palm of your hand. Yeah,
but that's what I mean by it's quite an amazing thing.
It is,
the connectivity technology itself. It's like...
No, the biggest issue was always realigning expectations set by the 3G to 4G step change, which was such a big deal. 4G actually made the mobile internet possible. 3G just kind of teased it.
Yeah.
But it was the bandwidth was so shit that you couldn't do anything particularly useful with it.
Yeah.
But what it did do is catalyze the hype cycle, because we all remember the 3G auctions and around the time of the dot-com bubble and all that sort of thing. Whereas 4G was like, oh shit, okay, this is for real now. I can stream video on my phone, which you could never do before. And I think that was it, really. We've all had to, including us as journalists, just get our head around the fact that 4G to 5G is nothing like the change that 3G to 4G was.
Yeah, well, it's... I mean, I think it's always going to be disappointing once you've got something that's usable anyway. It's never going to be like that jump from actually like not having a mobile internet service to having a mobile internet service.
Indeed.
It's like the first time I ever got water. Well, the water's only going to get cleaner, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not saying we were right to have those expectations, but I can understand why we did at the time, because you just draw on precedent. Yeah. You just assume that the past can repeat itself, and it didn't.
Yeah.
I thought, on this piece that we alluded to, so we kind of summarised it and gone off a few tangents. I'm just going to bring it back. I like the fact that a couple of regular podcast guests started commenting on it and actually sort of disagreed with each other a little bit, which is even more fun. So
I haven't seen half of these comments.
So in response to it, Dean Bubley, analyst, said, I largely agree. One exception is FWA, fixed wireless access, which for... I presume the minority of our audience who doesn't know what that is it's using wireless signals, but to create a broadband. Yeah. So it's using wireless instead of copper or fibre. And And he goes, I largely agree that one exception is for FWA, although that's actually seeing a bit of a slow renaissance of millimetre wave. The other need is for ultra-dense locations, which we've kind of just covered. So the FWA bit is something that then another regular guest of ours, Neil McCree, responded to. And he said, 5G isn't optimised for FWA. It's ridiculously expensive. I really like... Neil is a great follow on LinkedIn because he just gets involved.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to get stuck in.
Well, he has a strong opinion as well.
Yeah,
He doesn't sort of
exactly.
pull
No,
his
he doesn't.
punches.
Exactly. 5G isn't optimized for FWA. It's ridiculously expensive and operationally challenging. There are much better solutions for FWA that are much more cost effective and 5 to 7 times better spectral efficiency. Event locations, and then he makes another point. It's a bit in the weeds, but it's relevant. Event locations don't need national licenses, but business districts need licensing or some kind of ability to share spectrum, otherwise they're in any competition or imperative to invest. So I thought it was interesting. It wouldn't have occurred to me, because obviously I don't have anything like Neil's knowledge of the matter, that 5G isn't optimized for FWA. He didn't really elaborate other than to say it's expensive and operationally challenging, but I think that's kind of what he's saying. Is he's pushing back on Dean, who's in turn slightly pushing back on your article, saying, well, actually, FWA is a really strong 5G use case. And he's going, it's not a 5G use case.
I don't think Dean's pushing back on my article, because mobile is very much in the headline. So...
Okay, well, it's just that he said, I largely agree one exception is.
I think it finishes with it saying something about FWA potentially, or
Let's have a look.
or there's an allusion to where it could make money. The whole article's about using it for cellular, for smartphone coverage. But
So Dean was going off on a little bit of a tangent.
No, I mean, I totally agree with Dean, and he's not the only person I've heard who said that. So this was a point that Earl Lund made as well. He said it probably would get used for that's the use case, is FWA. There might be some other things, but that's the use case for it. Is that? I mean,
but Neil seems to reckon that 5G is shit for FWA.
Well, maybe Neil does, but FWA has been used. 5G has been used for FWA clearly at quite a big scale in some countries. I mean, T-Mobile seems to make quite a lot of money out of doing that, and they don't have a customer service reputation. So it's obviously been.
Well, maybe we'll invite Neil back on if you're listening.
The question for me is
elaborate a bit.
How big an opportunity. So for a start, we're not talking about 5G anyway. We're talking about 6G. So maybe even if 5G isn't optimized, 6G might be. And the other question is, and this was something Lum raised, does it become then cost competitive with fixed technologies? Because at the moment, FWA,
which I can't see.
Well, he thought there was a possibility. He thought there was a possibility it could be. Now, so. I mean, you're scratching your head, but I don't know enough about that.
I scratched my chin because I had an itch, not because I was being sceptical.
I don't know enough about the technology to know, but it's
But I tell you what, I don't know enough about it. But I tell you why I am sceptical. Why, if that had been a sceptical scratch rather than just an itch scratch, is because wireless can never compete with the capacity of fibre.
Right.
I mean, to the best of my knowledge.
But he also don't have to go around digging up streets and putting in loads of
so there's that trade-off. But if we're talking like for like, if you can have fibre, you're always going to choose that over wireless, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target, and what's happened up till now is that fixed has always been ahead of mobile. But will that always be the case? Will satellite always be worse than cellular? I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to look into the future without really knowing the answer. That's been what's happened up to now, for sure. Fixed has always been ahead of mobile. Mobile's always been ahead of satellite. Do those things have to stay the same forever? I don't know. But there might come a point when I don't know, when it is competitive on. I mean, it doesn't even need to be. This is the thing. It's like, how good does it need to be? It's like people sort of talking about general purpose processors in virtual RAN compared with application specific integrated circuits. Oh, they're not as good. They're not as performant.
Trade-offs.
They're trade-offs.
The whole thing we were talking about earlier.
They're not as good at performance. And it's like one of the pushbacks you get on that from people like Gabe, actually, I think in the past has said this. It's like, well, they're obviously good enough. You know, Verizon's doing that at scale across its network with Samsung. That's a virtual RAM based on Xeon processors, and it's good enough to support the speeds they need. So if it's good enough speed-wise, you know, maybe it doesn't get to the gigabits per second or megabits per second or whatever it is that you're going to get on fixed, but it gives you everything you need on Netflix and whatever it is you might be using and maybe it's a lot cheaper to deploy, and then all of a sudden it makes sense to do it.
There could be an argument that that we should slow down the fibre rollout now if we've got to the point where, I mean, I've got fibre, you got fibre?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, is fibre's going to be rolled out by the time it comes along. That's the problem for
whether we like it or not. But so there could be a hypothetical argument if that wasn't the case, where you go, okay, we've rolled fibre out to 75% of the population or whatever.
Yeah.
Let's just knock that on the head now and switch to FWA for the remaining 25%. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen, does it?
I mean, a lot of Europe and I think even the US now, fiber's pretty widely deployed. But maybe 6G FWA has some opportunity in. I mean, there's always going to be those remote areas where you never get any fibre, even in developed markets. You know, if you're up in the Scottish Highlands or whatever.
But that's where I'll gently push back on Dean's point, where he says one exception is for FWA, and obviously, Dean, if you think I'm talking shit, come on the pod and tell me. I don't mean this in an adversarial way at all. It's just for the sake of debate. I just still, for all the good points you've made, just question the utility of FWA, if only because fibre's becoming quite ubiquitous.
Yeah, but it's like it's the same as satellite, isn't it? People are very excited. They obviously see a growth opportunity there.
Yeah, they do, which is eluding me, if I'm honest.
Well, because I suppose if you look at it the way that T-Mobile would have looked at it in the States, is that it's a fairly big country, even if it's like a small percentage of the population who are in areas that you can't get fixed line technologies out to. It's still a lot of people that you can go and serve and get additional revenues that you wouldn't be getting otherwise. It's not like a smartphone where everybody's already using 4G. This is new business. That's the excitement, isn't it? It's completely new business, yeah?
New business. And then perhaps some more complicated business models associated with a phrase that William uses of HETnets, i.e. ubiquitous connectivity, where you're dynamically switching between various modes. Yeah. Depending on what's available. And if you've gone out into the middle of the outback, then obviously you've got to revert to a satellite and all that sort of thing. I wanted to just come up with some other comments on that story before I move it on. You've had you have plenty of positive ones. Some bloke called Paul Berryman, who's an independent board director and advisor.
He used to be the CTO for PCCW.
Okay, cool. So he's a legit expert.
Yeah.
He goes, an excellent thought-provoking article says to me the industry should shelve thoughts of 6G and focus on doing 5G properly, which is a point that we've made a few times. Another bloke called Dan Deverson quoted a little bit from your piece. He goes, but if that signal even runs into leaves on a tree, it doesn't work. So that would have been you making a point about propagation.
I think I was quoting what's his name?
Oh, someone else. Okay.
Johan Weiberg. He used to be CTO at Vodafone.
Yeah, I remember him.
He was quoted in my story. He said that in 2017.
There we go.
He was dubious about spectrum above 6 gigahertz.
There we go. So what's changed? And then he goes, his own commentary, this Dan Deverson goes, everybody knows this. So who are the geniuses promoting unusable bands? Brackets, the article mentions Verizon, but it lives at the intersection of the laws of physics and finance, and that makes no sense.
Right.
But then we got your mate, Kumar Balachandran, who writes...
showers this week Kumar's got.
Well, he's going to get more, because to be fair to him, he engages a lot on LinkedIn, which I encourage, even if sometimes the nature of his engagement I don't applaud. And he had one. I'm going to try and quickly paraphrase it. I was trying to sort of summarize it in my mind while you were talking, trying to multitask. And he sort of goes, I'm going to get to the bit where he has a pop at your piece. He goes, what's missing from this article is that being able to operate a network across a wide variety of bands allows the operator to provide a uniform quality experience. That's kind of what we were just saying a minute ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And we've got...
I agree with him then on that.
Yeah, well, and bear in mind that this, and we have to... This is going to sound like an ad hominem and thus make me a complete hypocrite, but it's not. I just think that when people engage, it is relevant to know where they're coming from. And this person on LinkedIn is senior expert at Ericsson Research for Spectrum Management.
Yeah, so he's going to have knows what he's talking about.
Oh, he knows what he's talking about. I'm not questioning it for that for 1 second, but he's also going to have an agenda.
Yeah.
And his agenda is going to be in favour of the utilisation of spectrum for cellular connectivity. That's his fucking day job.
Yeah.
So I think it's reasonable to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
Whereas I'd like to think, and I'll let other people be the judge, that no one can pin us to an agenda because we're journalists.
Yeah.
And we certainly don't. We're certainly not influenced by advertisers or commercial.
You could also argue that these higher spectrum bands that come with these, enormous radios that are very expensive are in the vendor's interest anyway, because they imply the need to. For a start, the prices are quite high.
Well, of course,
and they imply the need to densify the network. So it's more sites.
Yeah. So bloke from Ericsson goes, I don't know what you're talking about. All people need to do is buy more fucking kit.
It's basically it's like Nvidia with GPUs. You need to put them in your edge facilities.
Exactly. And I don't think it's unfair to note people's incentive structures. In fact, we might get onto that later when we talk about the more geopolitical side. Incentives are all there. We all have incentives.
Yeah.
And they don't go away. Even the super rich still operate in a framework of incentives. Those incentives might be ones that we can't relate to because they've just got sick amounts of money. But, there's still that. I'm certainly not super rich. Do you think I'd be hanging out with you losers if I was?
Well, I still come in.
You still come in. You still come in with your new flat. And he sort of goes on. He's a bit wordy, bless him. And he goes, but to your point, he goes, there's nothing that prevents the use of higher frequencies if you give me antennas as large as I'm able to use at lower frequencies, which seems to be a kind of a pitch to, flog antennas. And he goes on, and that's fine. But it was one of the ones where he was less ad hominem-y. But I want, because he takes the trouble to write at length, I think it deserves acknowledgement. So that was that. Let's move it on to the next thing of yours that William flagged up, which is the one where our mate Kumar just said that you're talking out your arse. I think that was the one. And so this was Telco's...
so Kumar said I'm talking out my arse in two separate...
Yeah, well, he seems to engage when William Webb shares one of your things and says, I think this is great. That seems to prompt him.
It's like a red rag to a bull.
It seems to be. And what I'm getting from it, I don't know the guy, I've never spoken to him, but what I'm getting from just from his LinkedIn output is he's pushing back on on this core thing that we've been talking about for all the pods so far, which is the utility of this higher frequency spectrum, which is fine. By all means, push back away. But I reserve the right to note your incentive structure in so doing.
Yeah.
So that was the one, and we spoke about this the other day, where your headline was Telco's guilty of 6G mixed messages and falsehood. So I'm not going to go over that again because we did it the other day. I don't want to bore our audience. But again, let's cover. You did mention that before, but I want to cover. He goes, and actually, William did quite a detailed sort of summary of your piece in this one with lots of bullet points and all that sort of thing. Anyway, old Kumar responded. He goes, more spectrum is inimical. I'm trying to remember what inimical stands for. It's like contradictory. Is it? Does it mean something like that? Yeah. To fair share payments. Wouldn't abundance lower the value that scarcity produces? And then he goes on. Yeah. Let's see if we can get where he gets to the point, because that feels like a little bit of a tangent. Here's where he's feeding into his day job. Less investment in the network hurts internet services and the role of automation. Well, in other words, invest more in the network. Well, guess who's the beneficiary of more investment in the network? His fucking employer.
Yeah.
And then he goes, let's do the one that precedes his ad hominem. This paragraph. MNOs are made up of a number of people communicating different messages in context. It's easy to take statements out of context, personalise not just one company but an entire industry, and declaim hypocrisy. So this is obviously all still a dig at you. It works for Wi-Fi, for nations, for religions, for blocks of nations favouring some ideology, name it. Yeah, I'll name another ideology, whoever pays your bills, Kumar.
Well,
let me quickly finish. Polemics aside... he says, having just fucking done a polemic, we should ask whether stopping investment in IMT is warranted as policy. If the scheme is so flawed, the free market will ensure the industry pays the price. Why not? Not there yet. And then he finishes off, which is the thing that you mentioned the other day. I've seen light reading which he writes as a single word without capitalising the R, like as if it's German or something.
Well, it's like the URL, I suppose.
I guess so. I've seen Light Reading spout some utter nonsense from this author for a long time. Anyway, I'll shut up now. You were going to...
Well, I was just going to say that the paragraph before that one, where he goes on about it's easy to take things out of context and based on what one company said and all that lot. I don't think I was taking anything out of context based on what one company said. That was a letter from the GSMA signed off by a whole bunch of operators and CTOs. The very same people.
The GMA, which is supposed to be the spokes people for the industry.
And it had the names of a lot of CTOs at the end of it who are also members and outspoken people in the NGMN going on about they want software upgradable 6G. I've just gone on about how I can sort of see it's more nuanced than that. And you can have sort of 6G for... with these higher spectrum bands for sort of city centres and relieving pressure on some of these cell sites. But the problem is this idea that you should give the whole band to the cellular industry, and this is what we were talking about on Wednesday when we had Dave on, implies that they're gonna be using this more widely than that. I would say, we're not talking about a bit of infill here and there, because if we were, why would they need to hoard the whole thing? Ofcom's taken a really interesting approach on this, by the way. I didn't even know this until this week, but their approach is to give that band for the time being to sort of Wi-Fi, but with a kind of like a proviso that in the future parts of it might be used for the cellular industry. So like a shared sort of system.
But not to sequester it.
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're keeping it open for both options at the moment. You're allowing Wi-Fi to go in there, but you might at some point in the future decide that you're going to auction some of it off. I know there's been some pushback on that from cellular, but people I've been talking to think that's quite a sensible way of doing it, and it might be a system that you see being introduced in other parts of Europe as well. You were laughing at something.
Well, I'm laughing because I'm again multitasking because I'm trying to digest some of the interaction on LinkedIn so that there isn't a pause with me reading after you've finished talking.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, that does mean I'm not giving you 100% attention, but I'm trying to think of the audience.
Okay.
And so Kumar says his stuff. I'm just calling you Kumar, not Balachandran, because I'm worried I'm going to fuck your surname up.
Well, you just said it. It sounded pretty good to me.
I know, I've got the hang of it. I know, maybe I'm selling myself short. And William Webb responded to him and took his points in return, but most of his, to totally condense William's responses, is like each of the points he made is he just sort of went, well, why? Inferring that Kumar had made an assertion that William wasn't convinced by.
Yeah.
And then on the final one, the ad hominem, he goes, Light Reading, not a very logical line of attack. And then he invited him to push back, which Kumar, true to form, accepted the invitation. So then his pushback... I haven't
read his response. So.
His pushback, and again, I'm trying to digest it. He was talking about data growth being helped by a virtuous cycle. So in other words, it's the standard thing. Have you ever heard... Gordon Brown used to talk about it as his pretext for borrowing more money.
Right.
When he was Prime Minister, or maybe when he's Chancellor, or both. And he used to talk about a thing called the multiplier effect. Have you heard the multiplier effect? So, and I don't think he coined it. It's an established economics thing. But it's like, well, imagine it as an individual. So you got your household accounts, and you got a sense of how much debt you're in. You could choose to get in an uncomfortable level of debt, but the way in which you would justify it is by I'm borrowing in order to invest.
Yeah.
So, I guess a mortgage might be an example of that. And that used to be how Gordon Brown described the multiplier effect. Because yes, we're going to get in more debt, but actually we'll be in less debt in the future because of...
You spend money to make
money. It sounds like Keynesian economics.
Well, yeah, it is very much that sort of thing. And that seems to be what Kumar's saying.
Recently, has it?
You what?
Hasn't always worked recently.
No, I think it's bollocks. But I'm
not saying it's complete bollocks.
No, well, I think I am saying it's complete bollocks because the investments so the multiplier effect is supposed to be that we borrow 10 billion now.
Yeah.
But it's going to yield 15 billion in benefits, so we're actually 5 bill up.
Yeah.
But the reason it's bollocks is those benefits never come along. It just gets thrown into the black hole of debt and benefits and NHS and all this stuff. There's very little actual investment that goes on.
Yeah.
The borrowing just goes to cover going concerns rather.
If you were borrowing the money and doing what the US does and throwing it into infrastructure or something, then maybe it'd be different. Not that I'm saying I'm a big fan of the idea that you should build big semiconductor plants at government expense or whatever.
Yeah, and most of the US borrowing goes in the same direction as I just characterised it anyway.
Yeah, well, maybe the US is a bad example, but they have done it in the past, haven't they, in the US? And they've certainly done it in parts of the further.
So you get some of it. So you do get some investment in infrastructure, but that's the other problem with the multiplier effect is it never yields these projected multiples.
Yeah.
So even if you do spend it all on investment rather than going concerns, those projected multiples, which are produced by people with incentives to paint the most rosy picture possible.
Yeah.
We know what it's like. People commission a forecast. Company that has a vested interest in A, we get these press releases all the time. Company that has a vested interest in A commissions report that proves that A is a really fucking important thing. So these things happen all the time. Anyway, this seemed to be where Kumar's coming from, which is like the more we invest in the industry, the more somehow data traffic will grow. And obviously William was going to disagree with that because he's not supply side, he's demand side. And we think you can invest all you fucking want in the industry. But if any of us three don't want to consume more mobile data than we do now, because there's no reason for us to, because nearly all of the video streaming we do, which accounts for the vast majority of data, we do over fixed networks, like Netflix at home and that sort of thing. Then, so then what we've got in that dynamic between Kumar and William is a sort of supply side and demand side typical.
I agree and I disagree with them because I take the point. I hate the expression, it's a cliche, but you've got to spend money to make money.
Yeah,
obviously, if you've got a good business idea, then the worst thing is that you don't get anybody to put any money into that, or that you work for some company that never really invests in your area, and you could see that if they did it, it'd make a big difference. Yeah. But you've got to have you've got to be able to point to some outcome, and the problem at the moment is the demand that just isn't there. To William's point,
yes,
it just doesn't look good.
I can't see it. Just anecdotally, as an individual, I can't see what the driver is for me to dramatically increase my mobile data consumption.
Yeah, so they're not going into if they're in their Dragon's Den meeting like Ericsson with all those weirdos. You don't really have a clue anyway, half of them.
I fucking hate that. I've never watched it because.
But if they were in their Dragon's Den meeting and they were going, well, we need to spend all this money on these really expensive radios, and they were going, well, what's that all going to be for? Then they'd have a really hard time, I think, trying to sort of they'd probably start bringing up things like Vonage and APIs and completely lose them. Yeah,
or start talking about VR or robotic surgery or whatever these other silly utopian things that we've taken the piss out.
Yeah, and then the thing is, it's not even that those things won't happen actually. Because they might. It's, well, how do the operators make money out of that then? Because it's just more connectivity revenues, isn't it? It just replaces what people are spending on connectivity. It's like when data came along with 4G and everybody went, oh, they're making loads of money from 4G data now, and it's like a great growth. It wasn't a growth opportunity at all because people had spent more on voice services in the past, and all it did was replace that.
Well, we should actually, because we're already running out of time and there's a whole different segment to do with like trade policy and that sort of thing I want to get into.
Running out of time on this pod already? Oh my god!
Well, we've only got less than an hour, and there's still quite a lot I want to cover.
Okay.
So one thing I'll wrap up on that is I'll give the final word to Kumar because William pushed back and said, actually, I think light reading's good, so shut the fuck up. He didn't say that. I wish he had. But here's Kumar's more substantial reason why he doesn't rate you. He goes, when there's a pattern of mocking and polemics in every article denigrating an entire industry, I see no harm in pointing out the lightness in the writing. So no, I do not think much of Morris's articles. He thinks enough to engage on LinkedIn though, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And I think maybe he's slightly missing the point there, which is... And I don't think.
Well, I disagree that I'm mocking anyway. I don't go around mocking the industry.
You have personality and colour in your writing.
Yeah, but I'm not mocking the entire industry. And if you don't have people who are prepared to raise questions for an industry, by the way, that you guys fucked up at Ericsson, you really did.
Yeah.
I mean, they're under enormous pressure at the moment, as I understand it, from their investors for spending $6 billion on a company.
And you keep hearing rumours about Ekhone getting turfed out.
Any returns at all. So if they can't take it from me then they're going to be in real trouble. Because if I'm saying things like this, there's no doubt in my mind that the Dragon's Den people who really know what's going on are really giving them shit behind closed doors. Yeah.
And I agree with you, and I would, because I'm your mate and I'm also a journalist, so I'm probably gonna support team journalism anyway.
Yeah.
You know, to admit my own incentive structure.
By the way, I'd also say that I don't think like there's enough critical telecom journalism anyway at the moment.
Indeed,
as it is.
Indeed,
I think the likes of Ericsson and those companies over the years and the GSMA have got far too used to having. How do I describe it in a kind way? But sort of fairly bland write-ups, accommodating write-ups of what's going on. So to have a few people sort of digging the heel in really isn't, you know.
And I wonder if, you know, there's a thing they say in comedy, which is, you know, all jokes are funny until they're about you. I presume that our mate from Ericsson wouldn't have a problem if you wrote something really sarky about Nokia.
Well, yeah.
So, you know, this is where people just got to have a bit of humility. Okay, he's wound you up, and we could argue that's part of your job, is to wind people up, not the primary part. But I think an important secondary part of being a journalist, as you were just saying, is to be a bit provocative and to ask awkward questions and to hold a mirror up to the industry. Because if we don't do it, who the fuck's going to do it?
Yeah.
I just think, my unsolicited advice to him would be, you know, just take a deep breath, have a little ego check before you get involved, and just address the substance of it, not whether or not what emotional outcome you've got from it.
Put it this way: if you didn't have people who were prepared to be critical or raise any of these questions, and you just everybody's saying it's all wonderful and let's go ahead and do things, do you think the industry would be better off because of that? Do they think they'd be doing really well now if they didn't have anybody saying, "Hang on a minute,
Ericsson might be
a
better
sensible thing to do"?
Yes, I agree. And so, actually, before I move it totally, you referred to that GSMA thing, which we wrote about earlier in the week, and then you just wrote today, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And your headline...
I mean, the GSMA, I have to be honest with you, they really do a good job of sort of just making themselves like a target.
But again, we got the incentive structures there. I mean, to be fair to GSMA, you know, they don't hide the fact that they're... I mean, they call themselves a trade body, but I call them a lobbying organisation.
Yeah.
/ massive profiteer from Mobile World Congress, which we've covered plenty of times in the past. But so it's their job to come out with, quote, research, close quote. And I won't diss it too much because my colleague Armita used to be at GSMA Research, so I'm sure it was awesome when Armita was there.
Yeah.
But you know, their research is naturally going to be skewed towards angles and topics and conclusions that benefit the mobile industry, because that's their day job, is to support the interests of the mobile industry.
Yeah. Well, they came out with this report this week anyway about that. So they had this whinge about we need the whole of the upper 6 gigahertz band.
Yeah.
And they had one this week about spectrum costs and what a burden spectrum costs are. And, you know, it's awful that we have to pay for these licenses. To which I have some sympathy, by the way. You know, I think if you're doing a government auction and you're trying to structure it or design it in a way that's deliberately intended to sort of maximise the proceeds that you get, you know, when the industry isn't doing brilliantly anyway, I think that's I can see why the telcos would feel and the industry feels.
So that was the broader theme. Was a bit of a bitch about the cost burdens on the industry.
But this idea that the suggestion in the article is that the spectrum burden's grown, you know, and it's much greater than it used to be, and things are just getting worse and worse and worse. Yeah. And some of the stats poor old us, and some of the stats they had in this to sort of back up this argument were really kind of suspect, I thought. I mean, for a start, so if you look at the actual what operators are spending on spectrum when it's become available over the last sort of 25 years, you go back to 2000 when 3G was auctioned, and that's the high point. That was £22.5 billion in the UK. I think it was about 40 billion in Germany. So I'm looking at this on a European basis at the moment, but because America's a bit different with all this stuff. But you get to that. I use the UK as an example in the story I wrote, but you get to sort of the 4G auction around 2013, I think it was, and it's gone down to about 2.5 billion. What that raised. There's a couple of 5G auctions, but the last one that happened in about 2021, I think it's 1.3. The FT had a headline about how it's missed targets and it's, from a government perspective, it wasn't particularly good because they wanted more money. Obviously, because they can, go off on some spending spree there.
Yeah, which is, by the way, we were saying earlier about the multiplier effect and all that sort of thing, and we touched on it with Dave the other day. But that's one thing that's always wound me up about spectrum auctions.
Yeah,
is just the transfer of wealth from the private sector to the public sector.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and then if you look at metrics that actually are used in the industry to value spectrum, and the one that I've always sort of seen and used as a sort of analyst in the past as well is this per megahertz per pop, which is sort of per megahertz per head of population, basically. Right. That's gone down dramatically. That was up at like $4, I think, in the UK in the 3G days. I think the last 5G auction, it's something like 12 cents, basically. 12
so that's a legitimate whinge that GSMA was making then?
Well, no, they're complaining the opposite. They're saying spectrum costs are going up, and I'm saying that the actual on a per megahertz per pop basis, that spectrum's actually got a lot cheaper.
Misunderstood.
Their whole thing is to say what a nightmare. It's all become dramatically more expensive, and so they had this weird thing where they've gone. If you look at cumulative spending on spectrum between 2014 and 2024, it's it's a much bigger share of revenues. And it just seemed like a daft way of looking at it to me. It's like, of course, it's a bigger share of revenues in 2024 than it is in 2014 because it's cumulative. So you basically added it up over 10 years. You've got to the end of that period and said, oh, look, the spectrum costs are much higher than they were in. Now, they have taken the trouble to, I looked at the methodology and they're trying to amortize stuff. So if you pay an upfront fee for spectrum and you've got a 20-year license duration, then you're knocking off a bit each year, basically. But the last 5G auctions happened in 2021, 2020 timeframe. So there's not that much of that's been going on so far anyway. A lot of those spectrums just get renewed anyway. They get renewed for some sort of tokenistic fee and then some annual charges. And there are some countries that actually just give you sort of spectrum in perpetuity. I mean, this is a point that was made in some Charles River Associates paper that was
done. And we chatted about this earlier in the week as well. Yeah.
So they're basically saying, isn't it awful that cumulative spectrum cost? It's like me saying my cumulative bill on beer is much higher now than it was in 2014. Well, of course it is, because I'm 10 years older and I bought loads of beer. So the figure's always going to go up. And what they've done is they've looked at it as a sort of percentage of annual revenues, by the way. So it's a nonsense figure. The other one that I thought was absolutely ridiculous was this per gigabyte revenue figure. It's gone down by 96%. What operators are making in revenues per gigabyte.
Yeah. Why is that nonsense?
Plummeted it's completely nonsense because operators it would only be a problem if operators charged per gigabyte and usage were dropping. That's the only way it would be a problem. Operators bundle massive amounts of gigabytes into a flat monthly fee, or they actually make it unlimited. So the reason that figure's dropped as much as it has is because everybody's bundled into data, which is a good thing for telcos because it shows they've got a valuable service.
So I'm going to steal mine what I think is the point they're trying to make there. By the way, that beer's only cold at the bottom. So
the point they're trying to make...
Well, let me have a go.
Yeah.
Is that costs for delivering that connectivity are a certain level. I think they're trying to make the point that we've
known
about.
Costs haven't gone up in line with those traffic growth.
Yeah. Well, that's good. No,
and that's not what they were saying.
Just
anyway.
Hold fire for 1 second. Jesus fucking Christ, give me a sec. Because I stress again, I'm trying to steel man their position for you to then tell me why that's full of shit. That's the purpose of a steel man exercise. And this is something that's been spoken about for a little while, which is that people expect more for less. People expect more connectivity, they expect more amounts of data going through the mobile network, but they don't expect to pay more for it.
Yeah.
So I think that was just their way of finding what they positioned as a new set of data points to make that quite well-established point.
Okay, but let's say that there hadn't been a big appetite for data services and people were only using 1 gigabyte a month. That figure would be massive, by the way. It wouldn't have come down 96%. It'd be really high.
Right.
Would operators be better off? No, because they're charging a flat rate for usage.
Yeah.
So you could either move to usage-based consumption, in which case they wouldn't be better off either because you're only using 1 gigabyte, or they can charge for a flat rate, in which case they wouldn't be better off because it's a flat rate. So it's just a completely nonsense statistic.
So what do you think? And that's fine. That's a good riposte. What do you think the incentive for the GSMA to
I think the
publish
incentive for the
this
GSA
report?
is to go, what a terrible situation we're in, let's have
And-
free spectrum, and
Right.
to release it a few days after their whole, we need the whole of the upper
So it's
6
like it
gigahertz
was related
band.
to the previous thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm
Probably.
reading the.
Yeah, well, I'm
they're
asking
more
you to speculate.
Machiavellian than they are, and it might be two different bits of the GSMA that have been responsible for these two things. One's obviously come from telcos to some extent, and one's probably come out of a bit that someone like Armita used to, work for. So maybe there isn't a direct link, but I mean, my sense is that they just want to make out that the industry, needs kind of free spectrum or low cost spectrum.
And I agree with that.
And I have some sympathy for that. But if you're going to do that, at least put up some sensible statistics.
Well, quite, and I think that's the point you make. Well, we understand their incentive. We understand that they have an incentive to get the violin out and go, poor old mobile industry, come on, public sector, throw us a bone, whether that's through cheaper spectrum, whether that's through lighter regulation, which I would always, well, not always, but I tend to approve of, whether that's through something even more flagrant, like just chuck us some taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
I'm sure if the EU or the UK just went, I tell you what, how about we chuck you billions of dollars of taxpayers' money that could otherwise go on hospitals or police or defence or schools or whatever, they bite their fucking hand off.
Yeah.
So that's what it feels like more broadly, is just a sort of plea for sympathy, a begging exercise to the public sector.
There's another one of there's the three daft metrics in particular, and the other one was revenues per megahertz. How many revenues you get per megahertz, which has gone down dramatically. I can't remember what the figure was, something like 60% drop. And it's like, well, of course it's gone down because the megahertz holdings of these companies has got bigger as they've picked up new spectrum. Like BT, for instance, if you look at BT, what it held before 2018, when the first sort of 5G auction happened, 2017, 2018, and then was one in 2021, I think its spectrum holdings have basically doubled because it got all this 3.5 gigahertz and 700 megahertz during those two auctions. So it's gone up from something like 180 megahertz to 360 megahertz. Did any analyst expect their revenues to double with them picking up? I mean, what a stupid way to look at it. Why would revenues track megahertz? You're looking at it in a really silly way there. No one in the industry or who covers the industry would ever have gone, oh, it should stay at the same level because we've picked up more spectrum. They've got bigger spectrum assets these days than they used to have. That doesn't mean your revenues are going to double with it.
Yeah, totally. Okay, let's move it on to the last thing where I want to sort of go off in a more like trade policy, geopolitical direction. A couple of things that I wrote this week. I haven't written that much this week. One of the things about my MO is, as I've said before in the pod, I'm like the last person who gets the choice of the stories available. Nick and Mary first, then Andrew, then me. And sometimes after all that's been doshed out, I look around and there's just fuck all. So I just find something else to do.
Yeah.
I've been doing other things, like I've been finalising the categories for our awards thing and writing the descriptions. There's always, when you're the editor, like Phil is for you,
Yeah, you got work.
there's
to do.
always other shit going on. Anyway, so I haven't written that much this week, and the two I have written are true to type for me, where they're a bit more geopolitical. And I did mention them on the previous pod, but I want to go over them again, and just as a springboard to talk about other stuff, which was, the biggest geopolitical / trade policy game in town is tariffs and US policy versus China, and the two overlap.
Yeah.
And that was my story written at the start of this week, where he paused these massive tariffs that he had with China. It was reciprocal. They paused theirs. There was still some residual shit left.
Yeah.
But the reason I think it's relevant, it's always relevant to talk about US foreign policy and trade policy because it's the biggest, most powerful country in the world. It's been a long time ally of the UK ever since they kicked us out. We've still managed to get on.
Not initially. We went to war again in 1812. And
Right, okay, fair enough. So always is an overstatement. For the last couple of 100 years then.
yeah.
But yes, I mean, it affects everyone. And it affects everyone like more broadly. When you talk about tariffs, it affects trade on the whole and all that sort of thing. When you talk about its cold trade war with China, it obviously affects everyone's trade.
Yeah.
And then you get more specific bespoke things, like them putting pressure on companies like TSMC or ASML to not give them chips and all that sort of thing. And then collateral damage to American companies like Nvidia and all that. And I thought, that the story I wrote a couple of days ago, which I did mention on the last pod, which just says US says don't use Huawei AI chips. And obviously Huawei is relevant to our day job, or else. It's kind of emblematic of what I think is interesting about how the US is conducting itself, which is it's got this bee in its bonnet that it can't let China catch up on high tech. Okay, especially AI, but also just decent chips.
Yeah,
the most cutting edge chips. In fact, I should fire up. I gave myself a little reminder. John Strand, another regular guest, he put up something on his site and shared it on his newsletter, where he said it's a guest blog by Richard Windsor, and we quite often quote Richard Windsor, even though we haven't met him. We were going to get him to come on the pod, the Mobile World Congress before last, but then he had a conflict.
I was reminded by John this week. He's actually in London quite a lot.
Is he? Well, Richard, he probably doesn't listen. I mean, I'd love to have Richard on because I really, really enjoy his output. He's very astute, and he teaches me a lot. And he's got this site called Radio Free Mobile, and he does on average like one public thing a day. Presumably, he makes his money from consulting in a non-public way, but he's very smart to share quite a lot of insight in the public because I presume that drives demand for his premium output. But Strandy goes, Richard Windsor's made a guest blog for his site, but all John had really done is get Richard Windsor's last two things and copied and pasted them into its newsletter. So John, I don't know why you did that. I don't know why you called it a guest blog. I know why you did it. I just think it's a bit disingenuous.
Well, I spoke to him about it.
John?
Yeah.
All right.
And he said that he'd liaised with him and some things have been sort of done on John's like recommendation and feedback.
I see. So there was a kind of...
It was a liaison.
There was a kind of mutual side to it.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So the two that John shared in his newsletter, they're slightly reverse chronological. The most recent one Richard wrote was China versus USA, the isolation game. And then the one immediately before that was called China versus USA, the Middle East goes west, which feeds into a story you've just written.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the isolation game one. I think it's interesting because American foreign policy, and it does slightly predate Trump, but it's very characterized by Trump's approach right now, is to isolate China. Is to sort of have this, I don't know, this ring fence, this geographical ring fence around China, where it's always going to hang out with Southeast Asia, it's always going to hang out with direct allies that are on America's naughty step, like North Korea and Russia, and all that sort of thing. But it's never.
Well, he might have thoughts of luring Russia away from them. You never know. He seems to think he gets on very well with Putin, doesn't he?
Yeah, but I think that's him. I mean, I think his broader foreign policy thing is to focus entirely on China, which means he doesn't want to have to be worrying about fucking Ukraine and Israel and that sort of thing. He seems very everyone reserves the right to characterize Trump without ever having met the bloke. But then he does have such a massive public profile. I'll tell you a funny, quick little tangent. I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Megyn Kelly, and she had this guy on called Walter Kern, who's a really interesting.
Megyn Kelly again.
She's
listening to Megyn Kelly on podcast.
Oh, I listen to her all the time. She's really good. She's really good. She's a bit conservative for my taste these days.
Yeah.
But when she's not totally leaning into the conservatism, she's a really good journalist.
Right.
And she had
like a former Fox News person.
That's right. Yeah. And there was a film where she was played by Charlize Theron, where she was being like hassled by the bloke who used to be in charge of Fox or something. Anyway,
that's a good movie, actually.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. But no, I've got a lot of time for Megyn Kelly. Anyway, and she had this guy Walter Kern on, and he just made one little analogy which I thought was so good. This is a complete tangent. But you know how Trump is? Like, we were sharing a little thing, I think, Pierre, you shared it, where Trump did an AI rendering of him dressed as the Pope. And we're like, what is this crazy fucker up to? And Walter Kern just said, they're just chew toys. So his analogy is when you give a dog a chew toy, and then it just sits in a corner and just spends however amount of time just getting through this thing instead of killing your slippers or generally sort of tearing the house up. And what he does, and what he's basically doing every time he does that, or he'll do that little meme about turning Gaza into fucking Trump world or whatever. What he's really doing is just throwing a distraction to people, and then they just obsess with this metaphorical chew toy instead of actually focusing on some of the more wacky shit that he does, a lot of which I don't approve of, especially when it tries to go around due process and tries to be very sort of
I don't approve of the chew toys though either.
Well, you don't have to approve of them. I just think it's an interesting...
They're quite damaging. I think they're worse than chew toys. It's more like chewing up someone's slippers that they've treasured all their life. I mean, the Pope thing, because I'm slightly irreverent about religion, and I actually thought it was quite amusing in a way, but I know a lot of Catholics didn't.
Yeah.
But I think the Gaza stuff's much more damaging in terms of Middle East relations, because it just sets these people up in the... If you're in the Gaza Strip at the moment, you know, that's a pretty horrendous sort of situation to be going on. To make light of it...
Yeah, I don't approve either.
I think just things that you say matter when you're president.
I'm not citing these things as approval. I'm just citing them as an interesting observation about his MO. Which I don't have to like, but it's his MO.
Yeah, no, anyway. I'm not saying I disagree with the rationale. I just think it's just very damaging and
and it's very odd. But I do think what he wants his ultimate, and this does predate him because I think the Biden administration was like this. They view China, understandably, as their biggest geopolitical threat. As I've said countless times on this pod before, I kind of push back on the whole concept of, well, why can't China become the predominant sort of powerhouse of the world? There's nothing that says America has to stay there forever.
Yeah.
But that's not how America views it. So fair enough. And it wants to isolate them, and then...
Well, you wouldn't like it if they were trying to impose their sort of way of doing things on the rest of the world.
Certainly
as
not.
America does. See, I don't
like either.
Well, I don't like either, but I think we've probably had this conversation a million times before. I'd rather the Americans were doing it because I quite like their system.
Yeah, I've conceded that point.
I've
conceded that point, but as a libertarian, bullshit bingo time.
Yeah.
You know, interesting. I was just listening to a podcast on the way in by a publication called Reason, which is an American publication which calls itself libertarian, and just to maybe define terms. You know, a libertarian is basically someone who's distrustful of the state entirely.
Yeah. The
difference between a libertarian and an anarchist thinks there should be no state. A libertarian thinks a state is a necessary evil, but wants to try and keep it at the minimum viable level.
That's quite a healthy thing, really.
I think so.
Yeah.
And so, for example, libertarians are not keen on Trump right now because he's doing a lot of stuff which is borderline tyrannical.
Yeah.
Where he's completely circumventing due process, he's circumventing the legal system, he's circumventing Congress, the legislature.
Yeah.
And he's just going, fuck it, I'm going to do what I want. So back to that chew toy thing. That's why he does it. Because he wants people to focus on the chew toy while he does these tyrannical things.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, you're making him out to be much more Machiavellian than even I would.
Well, I think he doesn't... For people who hate him, they possibly underrate how clever he is.
Yeah.
I think sometimes he's not. I think sometimes he completely shoots from the hip. But bear in mind, he doesn't drink.
I don't think he's an idiot. But
he doesn't drink, so he doesn't do stuff when he's off his face. Yeah. But he does do impulsive stuff.
Yeah, he does impulsive stuff. I mean, I would never say he's an idiot, but I also don't think he's like, you know, the brain of the US or anything. I mean, I don't see him as some sort of 3D chess playing, you know, like he's on a different level to the rest of us. He's not an idiot, but he's a bit of a dick.
Oh, he's certainly a dick. But you can be, you know, God, I'm not going to go off from there, but
he's of above average intelligence.
If anyone ever wonders about this vernacular, just listen to the brilliant monologue in Team America, where they talk about dicks and two other types of people, and it's just the most brilliantly obscene extended metaphor you'll ever hear. Team America, World Police, dicks, etc., etc. I'm not going to say the other ones in case there's some words that I never use and I haven't worked out whether they're kosher or not. Anyway, you need one more beer?
Go on then. Why not?
You want Peroni?
I don't really want an alcohol-free Peroni.
It's
not alcohol-free.
Okay.
The Bex was.
Yeah, Bex was. bringing it back. Richard Windsor is basically going, look, this is, and he writes a lot in his public stuff. He writes a lot about US trade policy versus China, because his interest as a former equity analyst is, what effect is this going to have on equities? What effect is this going to have on markets? And he says, which I completely agree, that ultimately it's going to lead to a bifurcation. It's going to lead to a multipolar world. Whereas the Chinese sphere of influence, US sphere of influence, and everyone's diminished because the network effects get diluted as a consequence. And I agree with all that. And I wish, this is my hippy dippy thing, I wish they could just fucking get on.
Yeah.
And there are some signs that maybe I'm giving Trump too much benefit of the doubt, that maybe this thing with all the tariffs, which turned out to be bollocks, but maybe that at least did catalyse some kind of interaction, some kind of dialogue, where China can be held to account for taking the piss, which it does do on trade policy. It's very protectionist. It's very sneaky when it comes to intellectual property.
Yeah, I don't completely go along with Richard Windsor's thing on that.
Go on then.
Well, I think he's used this expression "splinternet" before.
Right.
Now, I agree that would be incredibly damaging, really, to have, because the internet's has been a global thing. It has been a thing that's almost synonymous with globalization. There's one internet now. It's heavily restricted in China. We know that, but it's still the internet. And there's been talk of, and I think Russia's come into this conversation as well before, that there could be like a different World Wide Web for those countries or something.
Right.
Now that's a big deal. But I think this whole,
but there sort of is already, like the Great Firewall and all that.
Yeah, there is, but it's still on the same. It's still built on the same underlying
just
platform,
with lots of filters and barriers.
Yeah. If it was a different platform, then that's. I mean, to me, the whole we've got two ecosystems, for instance. I mean, we're almost there anyway now, actually, in the sector we cover in radio access networks. I mean, all right, there's one standard, yes.
The vendors are obviously splintered.
But the vendors are incredibly splintered. Like, Huawei's increasingly not involved in, like, Europe, and it's never been involved in America, really, to a very small extent, and that's going.
Because rural ones.
It's got its own sphere of influence, and then you've got Ericsson and Nokia that have got their, and Samsung that have got their sphere of influence. It's sort of happened, and if you talk to people on the economies of scale side, they often push back at that on that idea that it's going to be an absolute disaster. You don't have to go back that far to 3G days where we had a couple of like 3 sort of international standards, and it was a bit more expensive, but I still feel in the
different CDMAs and all that.
But even if it went to that, I still don't think it would be that devastating from an economies of scale perspective to have a Chinese, in a world of 8 billion people or whatever it is, to have a Chinese sphere of influence.
No, I guess meeting you and Richard Windsor in the middle, he's just saying there will be some diminution.
There'll be some diminution, but I'm not convinced it would be that much worse than it is now anyway, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think I'm slightly, I think it probably would be substantially worse, but it's really hard to say how much.
I can't envisage you having to sort of pay £100 for a contract.
No, I think if I've understood his writing correctly, I think he's talking more about innovation in the future.
Yeah,
I don't think he's talking about an immediate direct hit on consumers. He's just saying how, let's take, for example, bring it back to mobile. Let's take standards body 3GPP. 3GPP is made better for the contribution of companies like Huawei and ZTE.
Yeah.
Granted, they sometimes have these pissing competitions about how many patents they've got and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But they do have a fuck of a lot of very clever R&D people.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're...
Although the opponents of Huawei and ZTE would say, actually, they're just basically flooding the 3GPP with bods and ripping off what we've done in the West.
Maybe, and that will be a criticism. You're not saying you believe that. But that would be a criticism of the Chinese MO that I don't push back on too strongly. I think there's a lot of piss taking going on. And again, to Steelman, to give Trump the most flattering platform, he's trying to say, look, China, stop taking the piss.
Yeah.
He might say it in a sort of Michael Caine voice. China, you're taking the piss. Pack it in.
Yeah.
Or we were talking before we started recording about Stella Street and a different accent.
Mick Jagger.
I don't think I can do the Mick Jagger. China, just give it a rest.
Hey, don't take it easy.
Steve Coogan's Mick Jagger I really like.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Or he could be David Bowie. Go, China, give it a rest.
Did he do a song called China, David Bowie?
China girl.
I said China Girl.
Yeah.
It's baked in.
Sorry, everyone. We were listening to impressions before we started recording, so it's still in our blood. Anyone who hasn't ever listened to it before, look up Stella Street on YouTube. These two actors, John Sessions and Phil Cornwell, and they basically imagine this boring English suburban street, but it's entirely populated by big celebrities, and it's hilarious. And you know, some of the more obvious impressions like Michael Bloody Caine and all that sort of thing. What was I saying? Yeah, and so I think Trump's just saying pack it in. That could be one interpretation. The other one could be much more Machiavellian and actually you get this through, like in the piece I wrote, I did say this quote on the pod we did a couple of days ago, but it's worth repeating. In the announcement that was to do with these special restrictions that America tries to impose on the whole rest of the world regarding AI chips, and the reason they're doing it is they want China to not get hold of decent chips from people like Nvidia.
Yeah.
But it's not enough just to restrict the direct export from the US to China, because China will always find secondary markets. You know, they'll just buy it off someone who's bought it off America. Anyway, and so they came out with all these other things, which I just think are too repressive. They're too presumptuous. They're too much America trying to impose its will on the rest of the world. But there was a little quote from the announcement, which I said the other day, but it's worth repeating. So this is a quote from their press release. Today's actions ensure that the United States will remain at the forefront of AI innovation and maintain global AI dominance. This is their own words.
Yeah.
So they're not just saying, let's stop China taking the piss. They're saying our overall priority has to be to ensure our own dominance.
Yeah.
And it's like the rest of the world's going, hello, well, we consulted on this. Why do you get to be dominant? And they would argue because we got all the money and the guns, which is, I suppose, quite a strong argument. But it's not very diplomatic, is it?
Well, that's what I don't like about the. I mean, you could argue that all, you know, he's a businessman, isn't he, Trump? And that's what business is about. It's all about competition. Who's going to be the best? It's like in a sports arena.
And he's very transactional.
It's like in a sports arena. You're not going to say, "Oh yeah, I want to be just as good." You want to be the best guys in the world.
Yeah,
so you could.
I don't want to be a game loser.
If you're going to steelman him, you could say he's just talking the language of business. That's what business people do.
Yeah.
But one thing I don't like about his administration is that bringing that sort of business lingo into sort of the world of government, because what I'd like is an America that goes, our system and our views on openness and democracy and free trade are about lifting all, to use a Chinese thing, like, what is it?
Yeah, rising tide lifts all ships.
Boats.
Is that a Chinese phrase originally?
I thought it was, but maybe it's not. But I'd like them to say, and that's the sort of thing that America said in the past. It's like it's for everybody's benefit. You know, if we do well and we have a strong relationship with other countries and trade with them, then everybody benefits and democracy takes root. And this is the whole point of trying to bring China into the WTO in the first place.
Yeah, which I thought, by the way, was misguided.
So I hate all that shit as well.
And actually, there's some really interesting mixed messages coming from them on that very topic, because we had way back before, or around the time of Mobile World Congress, we had JD Vance go to this thing called the Munich Security Conference and tell off Europe for various things like free speech.
It's brilliant in the US at the moment.
Well, yeah. So aside from that, I mean, he was right, but you're also right that our free speech is terrible. I was reading something in the Spectator on the way up. It was a Douglas Murray column where he was juxtaposing, and this is anecdotal, and Douglas Murray is someone who will reserve the right to cherry pick to make his point. But he was talking about, I think, the Kent police. And the Kent police sent 6 police officers round to some guy's house because he said something on Twitter that was a bit off colour.
Yeah.
I don't think it was even that bad. I mean, he was opining about fucking Palestine or something.
Yeah.
And this same Kent police, according to the cherry-picked data that Douglas Murray used in his column, have got a 0.0% rate of resolving burglaries.
Right.
So basically, you can rob someone's house in Kent and on current data points, be sure that you'll get away with it. You could probably do it while playing The Prodigy really loud on speakers and saying, "Come and get me, coppers," and they still wouldn't fucking bother.
Well, they visited him because he'd written something on social media
Exactly.
about supporting
And
Palestine.
so the point of that piece, which again I perfectly admit would be very cherry picked to make a point, is that the police do fuck all about real crimes and just go chasing low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Why did I get onto that? What were we just saying a minute ago? There was a thing.
I said it's not very good in America either at the moment.
Oh
so-
right, yeah, that's it. And JD Vance was having a pop at the Europe, and examples like that Douglas Murray piece will be the sort of things that JD Vance was thinking about.
Yeah.
But then at the same time,
while they're deporting students for saying the wrong thing.
well, quite. Oh yeah, no, they're
or threatening Harvard with funding if they don't do things the way they want them to, and things like that.
yeah. If again, I mean, there's a lot of bad civil liberties
Or
going.
don't have a DEI policy because otherwise
Quite.
you won't get this.
Quite, you could go on, which I'm sure you would if I didn't.
I mean, they're such a
interrupt
bunch of hypocritical wankers.
They are.
They really
hypocrites.
are.
They are hypocritical wankers. But the point I'm leading up to, actually, is that Trump the other day just did a speech, which I thought was quite a good speech. Because politicians, they never write their own speeches. Whoever wrote it was quite interesting, and he's basically going, "Do you know what? I think America should stop poking its nose into other people's shit."
Trump said this.
Yeah.
Right.
But the reason I'm bringing this up is it was very cherry picked. He's going, look, we just do business with people. How you run your country is not our business. We're going to stop moralizing. And to your point about China joining the WTO, and everyone thought that would make them more democratic. I always thought that's disingenuous. It's not for us to tell China how democratic to be. I mean, it is for us to trade with them or not.
Yeah.
But and obviously we can opine about civil rights abuses like Uyghurs and all that sort of thing. But I don't think it's for one country to moralise over another country. They can cut off relations. They can say, right, you're too beyond the pale. We're not going to do it. But it's not for one country to tell another country you should be more like us. Just like it's not for me to tell you to be more like me.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the libertarian in me coming out again.
Yeah, I think the days of imposing democracy in other countries have gone.
Well, it hasn't worked, has it?
Yeah.
Especially when we go, let's invade them,
Yeah.
and then nation build. I mean, it's never worked, has it?
Yeah.
And perhaps the last time it did work was South Korea, which was like 75 years ago.
They're not worried about. They're not dealing with China on moralistic grounds. They're not dealing with China as this deal in Saudi Arabia showed this week.
This is exactly what I'm queuing up.
They're not dealing with China because they're worried about it being better than they are.
This is exactly what I'm queuing up because you wrote the story yesterday, and I bring up Saudi Arabia with you on a public forum with some trepidation for reasons that you will be fully aware of.
Yeah.
But you wrote a really interesting piece, and your headline was,
It's a good headline.
AI, Frat Pack and Cisco pile into Saudi Arabia for humane reasons. And I think you mentioned Humane the other day. So Humane is this new vehicle in Saudi Arabia for AI investment, and it's written HUMAIN, so the AI is deliberate.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a vehicle for like Saudi sovereign funds, which are huge. I mean, just the amount of money.
It's
oil money.
It's the Saudi Arabian AI equivalent of Aramco, basically.
Right. And anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit more about that story and why you wrote it?
Yeah. So Humane's a pretty interesting company. I mean, it shows that they're trying to be a big deal in AI in the same way they have been in energy. But unfortunately, I don't know if it's going to work the same way because they don't have.
They're trying to diversify.
They don't have any of the resources, so they're getting.
Like they're diversifying a
US.
lot into tourism in the Middle East as well.
And I mean, Christ, this guy's star has risen. A bloke that I've interviewed a few times before, and that we've talked about a lot. Tariq Amin, who used to be working for the shitty telecom sector. Imagine that.
No, he's hanging out.
He would want to do that crap.
He's hanging out with the
now he's
proper
basically
wedge.
in this country in Saudi Arabia.
Do you think he's got his own super yacht yet?
Well, he will have because he's now CEO of like this Saudi Arabian company that is the big AI thing that they have. And I saw him on his LinkedIn account. He posted sort of footage of this. Basically, a US delegation went to. It's very much it shows sort of Trump's transactional style of presidency. Really,
Totally.
He went over there on a flight, obviously with people like Sam Altman and Elon Musk. Hopefully, keep them in separate chairs.
Yeah, they don't get on.
They're not as.
They're still suing each other.
They're not as antagonistic as they used to be, but
fair enough. Well,
People
again,
like-
they're probably pragmatic. They'll get on when there's their greater interests are served.
Yeah, Lisa Su from AMD. I don't think Chuck Robbins who's the Cisco CEO was there, but he was. They were certainly.
And it was very
announcement.
ceremonious. They put on
Yeah.
like big, it was like the fucking king of the world had turned up.
It was, and they were all sort of shown into this room where you could see Trump standing next to MBS, and they all sort of shook hands with Trump and kind of bowed to MBS, and and basically the deal is. I don't really know, and no one really knows because they've been a bit vague about it, what humane, as they're calling it, is exactly going to do in AI. But it sounds like...
It's going to be fluffy and lovely.
It's going to be fluffy and lovely, and they're going to spend a shitload of money on American technology to set up all this AI infrastructure. And so all these companies, I mean, it's great if you're one of these companies, but AMD, Qualcomm, Nvidia, obviously, that was a
lot of chippies.
AWS and Cisco. I mean, one of the reasons I justified writing about it was that Cisco was included, and they're doing the same thing that we talked about a lot when we talked about Nokia's AI network infrastructure business. They're doing the Ethernet stuff for connectivity of GPU clusters.
And we all know, one thing we do know is there is a shitload of money going into data centers, and the pretext for that is AI.
Yeah, and so it's I thought, you were getting back to Richard Windsor, actually, because I did quote him a few times in this. So his two pieces that you were saying John had taken and put on their kind of site, one was very much about China specifically, and one was about this Middle Eastern deal, but very much with a kind of China flavour, very much, and I totally agree. It does. It sort of shows Saudi Arabia leaning the US way. It's
and the Middle East the
Middle
East is an obvious tug of love.
Yeah.
Geopolitical tug of love thing.
Totally.
Both China and the US would want to get Middle East on board.
So it's a great deal for if you look at things that way, it's a great deal for the US to have one of the wealthiest countries in the world with a lot of money to spend that they're getting from energy, pumping all this money into US chips and US connectivity infrastructure and cloud technologies and software. It's brilliant. I mean, like great commerce, as they say.
And I'm at risk of triggering you, but your opening paragraph, you did make the point that, and this is kind of how my preamble leading up to it, about Trump's speech about how we've stopped poking our nose into other people's shit. It was clearly directed at Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So leaving aside the point you made in your opening paragraph about a journalist called Jamal Khashoggi, which everyone reckons, I don't think it's been proved, but it's been broadly reported.
Well, it's the decision the US and the UK governments have come to, though, was that MBS was behind it.
Oh, they've officially said that?
Yes, that was ages ago.
Sorry, I forgot that.
If I'm going to be sympathetic towards Trump on this, that was pre-Trump. That was the Biden administration.
Okay, so countries in the West, including the US and the UK, have said...
Otherwise, I'd never have written that first paragraph.
And something of that magnitude wouldn't happen without him knowing.
That's the conclusion.
Well, that would be the more speculative thing, but Ian's saying that he got air cover by the fact that the governments had said it.
The UK government and the US government both came out and said that, and that was the whole reason that he was like a bit of a kind of like an outcast, like you didn't want anything to do with him. And then all of a sudden, they needed to have something to do with him because it was an oil situation.
Yeah, so to elaborate, there was a journalist called Jamal Khashoggi, who I think was Saudi Arabian by birth and ethnicity, but wrote for the Washington Post, and he was writing very critical stuff about the guy who's pretty much in charge of Saudi Arabia, called Mohammed bin Salman, who I fucked up on a previous pod.
NBS.
I called him IBS by accident. And everyone reckons, and as Ian's just corrected me in saying it's quite a formal reckon, that he had him killed and dismembered and then shipped out of the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey in fucking suitcases.
Yeah, dropped into the Bosphorus or whatever.
Yeah, where I was.
No, they burnt him.
Where I was about 6 months ago.
I can't
anyway, so that's really sinister, dodgy shit.
Yeah.
But then again, at risk of overdoing the moral equivalence, obviously everyone's done dodgy shit.
Yeah.
But I think that was the pretext of Trump's, we're not going to moralise.
Yeah.
He's basically going, look, if you've got to deal with the odd dodgy journalist, that's none of my business, which is obviously fucking scary for people in our profession.
Yeah.
I wish him well.
But
like you said too about...
But But I think that all shows how sort of transactional and Machiavellian it is,
Yeah.
because
Totally, I agree.
they won't, like, the whole thing about why we shouldn't deal with China. Then all of a sudden becomes, it's nothing to do with the fact that we don't like the way China runs its affairs. It's just we're too scared about them being better than us and bigger than us.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's exactly what it is, and that's fine. And let's just look facts in the face. Where I get annoyed by US trade policy and foreign policy is when it says not only are we worried about China knocking us off our perch as a global hegemon,
yeah,
but we think everyone else should be subsumed to our geopolitical agenda.
yeah.
And largely we are. Like in the piece I wrote, I made a little reference to this big trade deal that the UK made with the US, and it was just bullshit. There was nothing very substantial in it at
Some
all.
stuff about beef in it.
Exactly. So we, But
one
we've
thing
got
I
a
don't
long
think
history-
We should be buying from America anyway.
well, again, the libertarian in me, and I've said this before on the pod, I don't like the concept of tariffs full stop.
Yeah,
Tariffs are all inherently protectionist. Yeah, they're political things. They're not economic things. They're political things where the government, like apparently India's got loads of tariffs. And there'll be political things where they're protecting their own farmers
Yeah.
or their own manufacturers or whatever. And everyone does it, and they always escalate because once you impose a tariff on someone, they go, fuck you, and they reciprocate. And I just wish no one had any tariffs at all. Now, there's some argument, and maybe you might have some pushback on this, that you need to protect your people a little bit.
yeah.
But
Well,
I guess I'm a bit absolutist. I don't think you can do it a little bit because it always escalates.
Well, the arguments I'd say for doing it are, I mean, for the US to come out with the stuff it did on Trump's little whiteboards recently.
Yeah.
But that's just bullshit, clearly, because that was just based on trading
to do with
balances.
deficits. Yeah.
But the arguments for having tariffs, I would say, are if a country, and China's a classic case of this, with even in the sector we're in, is coming into a country and dumping products that are heavily subsidised by the government. Something Eva Du wrote about in her book House of Huawei, and I think it's pretty well accepted anyway that this was what was going on in the 4G.
Yeah, it's a sort of modern manifestation of mercantilism.
And then your local producers can't compete. Then that's an argument for having some kind of tariff barrier, to me.
Quite. And so my point is, so what China does and Germany's done to some extent is this mercantilism where we've always got to run a trade surplus, an export surplus. And it just winds me up. I just wish governments would just pack it in. And, and this is a much broader, nothing to do with even trade, a more political thing. But I was thinking on the train on the way down when I was reading some of these pieces. So as I just said a minute ago, libertarians want to have as little government as possible, but you still need some government. Like you need to have police, you need to have armed forces, you need to have people fixing potholes, whatever. Yeah. But it's when governments have these big, bright, top-down ideas where like, okay, we're going to just fix everything. They're ill-qualified. Top-down interventions are nearly always bollocks, at least because of the law of unintended consequences. Whereas bottom up, which is what markets are, is you're just relying on the wisdom of crowds. You're just thinking, look, things will sort themselves out if you just let them play out. Because the thing about markets, and this is going all the way back to Adam Smith, markets, you're relying on everyone's self-interest, incentive structures that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
You're relying on the fact that, I don't know, you and I keep doing our job. We produce what we do, in part because Informer keeps paying us. There's always incentive structures in there. And if Informer started saying, don't do this, well, we'd have to fucking think about it, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
And so that's what winds me up about a lot of this top-down stuff, whether it's tariffs, whether it's other sort of foreign policy, whether it's we should export our values to other countries like China or Saudi Arabia or Russia. And I take the point you made at the start of your opening paragraph about that. I mean,
I quite like my last two paragraphs in that story
Okay,
because the point. I mean, if you're going to go along with the US line that okay, we're not going to be moralistic about this, and we're going to. I mean, there's one argument that things like ethics shouldn't come into business, because if you start making judgments about who you're going to do business with on the basis of they've got a questionable regime, then that would actually probably wipe out a lot of the world's sort of trade. So let's just take that out of it. But the problem I have with it is. And again, maybe you could sort of stick up for Trump on this basis in that it was pre him, but about a year ago are we
we're close to wrapping up. No, carry on. Say what you're saying.
About a year ago, they sanctioned a company called Sandvine in the telecom sector. The Canadian company that does deep packet inspection technology, which allows you, it's sort of deep in the software side of the network and allows you to it allows you to see where traffic's coming from and traffic flows, and you can sort of figure out who's sending information and stuff.
And why did they sanction them?
They sanctioned them because Sandvine had sold stuff to countries like Belarus and Egypt, and I think the allegations were that those regimes had then used that for spying on political opponents and clamping down on dissidents and this sort of thing.
So it's like a secondary thing.
Yeah.
You did a thing which led to a thing which we don't like.
Now, I find it very dubious that America's sanctioning a company like that, which, by the way, is not an American company, it's Canadian. Very interesting these days that it's Canadian. And yet they'd have no problem at all with selling AI to a country that's known to sort of silence opponents by
I
going
completely
and
agree on that.
them.
And it's a double standard. What really winds me up, and maybe we'll wrap up
That was
here.
Jon Stewart's point on the Daily Mail is like, oh no, not our horrible foes like Canada and he names like UK, but Syria, that's all good,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's two final points I want to make, and I don't want to cut you off, Ian, if you've got anything else to say, but we've got to wrap up in a minute. One, I'm totally with you on double standards. I hate it when people moralise. And, I've said it in the past, I don't think it's possible for a company to have a moral position. And I actually don't think it's possible for a country to have a moral position. It's all trade-offs. It's all transactional.
Yeah.
You and I, we can all, the three of us individually can have moral positions, but that's different. And even then, we'd probably bury those moral positions constantly in order to pay the fucking bills.
Yeah.
Because there's very few people who can afford, maybe priests or whatever, although actually I shouldn't go down that rabbit hole. But in theory, people who are not motivated by wealth or commerce or money at all can be moralistic, but none of us can. Anyway, so I'll say that. And then the other thing, I think my final thought on all this stuff is, and I've said this once or twice before, is just musing on the concept of power. All these things come down to power. It comes down to, and this is where Trump actually wields this cudgel very overtly. It's like, I got power, you haven't. Do what you're fucking told. Or maybe Ray Winston, do what you're fucking told, mate. Yeah. And that's all these things are. They're just great big global pissing competitions. And what's annoying is, like, we're Western Europeans, English, French, but we all travel. I'm going to go to northern Spain on my summer holidays, and Europe gets very sneered at the moment because it's economically quite stagnant.
Yeah.
But then you go around, you spend time in rural France or rural England or rural Spain or Italy, and there's still people living really fucking cool lives. They're not necessarily generating that much wealth, and they don't have that much power. They don't have many guns and all that sort of thing.
I find this whole impression, it's quite this sort of idea that Europe's a stagnant place and it's all a backwater. So, you probably wouldn't mind me mentioning, and so I will, but Mitch Wagner, who used to work at Light Reading, now is at Fierce, came over for an event in London recently called FutureNet, and he put a big post up on LinkedIn about going around London with his wife and how surprised he was that it was actually quite pleasant and it wasn't all about knife crime, which is the impression that you get when you're in the US. And it's like, really, is that really? Because Mitch is obviously a bright guy. He's not someone who's likely to sort of be
that's how crazy the news is
persuaded.
There. Yeah. Well, I've got a cousin. I've got family who live in Texas, and sometimes they send me a thing going, "What's going on?" And I'm like,
and you look out the window, you're like, "It's fine."
Yeah, and no, but sometimes I'm like, to be honest, this is the first I've heard of it. First I've heard of it is via my Texan cousin. So that's a different tangent. Obviously, we don't have time for on the way information and news is disseminated.
Yeah,
but like, to the topic of power and how you've got America's got lots of power and guns and money and cultural influence, and China's the next biggest, and then Europe maybe as a bloc is there. But I just don't think most normies, most people like us, we don't think about power. I don't think about whether I can impose my will on you or Pierre, and I don't think any of the three of us think about that. We live in some kind of equilibrium where we just get on with each other, and actually power doesn't come into the fucking equation.
Yeah.
And that's what slightly annoys me about a lot of this geopolitical pissing competition. Is it's all about power, and why can't everyone just calm the fuck down?
Totally.
Okay, sounds like a good sentiment to end it on. I always get a hippy dippy thing at some stage. Yeah, on that one. Okay, mate. I only overran by 7 minutes, Pierre. So there we are. There's your little bonus episode of just me and Ian talking shit. And so I'll say thanks for listening to that, and make sure you join us for the next one.